In France, they could be on their way to banning girls under the age of 18 from wearing the hijab, the Muslim headscarf for women, in public. A proposed new law has passed in the upper house, the Senate, and will now be debated by the National Assembly. This is Roundtable. Hello from me, David Foster. In this programme, we'll look at why the French authorities want the legislation passed and why it's caused such an outcry. France's National Assembly will soon be asked to vote on banning all under 18s from wearing the headscarf in public. The upper house, the Senate, gave its backing to a new law earlier this month. It's all part of President Macron's anti-separatism bill. Macron is seeking re-election next year and wants new rules to tackle what he calls religious extremism. The headscarf amendment prompted a backlash on social media, with a number of users using the hashtag #HandsOffMyHijab to express their disapproval. Although the bill doesn't mention Islam, many French Muslims feel they are being singled out for unfair treatment by the French state. The government says the bill is meant to protect France's status as a secular country, but many of France's Muslims say it's they who need protection. Well, first of all, on this particular edition of Roundtable, we head to the southern part of France, to Vence, where we see and welcome once again Anne-Elisabeth Moutet to the programme, political commentator and columnist. In London, in the UK, we see Amina Sellik, an entrepreneur who says she faced hardships wearing a hijab growing up in France. We'll hear some of her story. And in Leeds, we see Naima B. Robert, founding editor of the UK-based Muslim women's publication Sisters magazine. And Naima, I'm going to ask you about what you're wearing in just a moment, but I'm going to go to Anne-Elisabeth first of all. A grown-up society should be tolerant, not feel threatened by the way that other people do things. It should be open to others' ideas. What has happened in France?
Well, this is a weighted question, because a grown-up society must be tolerant, but also must be aware of what the values of that society are, what the traditions of that society are, and what the national cohesion in that society means. I would argue that we can talk later about the bill as it was amended in the Senate, but the separatism bill, but the name of the bill essentially explains what it is. It says separatism. If you alienate yourself from society entirely, that is something that a society should look to and try and work out a way to work with it.
But we're talking on this programme not about the bill per se. We're talking about the one amendment you mentioned there relating to the hijab and women under the age of 18. Where does France feel threatened by that?
Actually, the French system is that every French child is a French national, and they have to have the same education and way of growing up within French society. And at age 18, you're allowed to choose exactly what you like. But the worry about specifically the hijab and young girls is that why should young girls be asked to and made by their parents or their community to wear a covering because they can't show part of their personality, they can't show their hair, they can't show their neck, when boys can't? And why this sort of reverse sexualization of girls in so many ways? That means if you're not wearing this, you're not modest, and if you're not modest, you will inflame men.
Anne-Elisabeth, hold it for now if you don't mind. Thank you very much for that so far. But Amina, let me come to you. And the point that's being made there is that in French society, you should fit in as the French people do.
Exactly. I feel like in France it's like you have a square and you need to fit inside. If you are not inside, and it's like you can't be in the French society and fit in that society. So for example, usually it's like without hijab, like having a lot of studies, a good job, this kind of thing. And if you don't have a good job, if you wear the hijab, if you are Muslim, you are not in that square, and unfortunately, you don't fit in the French society.
But on the other hand, I mean, I know you found it difficult growing up there. You left France to come to a different society, and therefore, presumably, those people that don't like what the French are doing could do the same as you.
Yes, but I feel in UK is a bit different, because even people that they don't agree with who you are, let's say, they still accept you. But in France, is even they don't accept, they show you, and you need to fit to their rules. And this is the difference that I found between UK and France, and that's why I came here in London.
Naima, I'm going to come to you. Thank you both, the first two of you, for summarising your positions. But Naima, I want to ask you this. I said to Anne-Elisabeth, you know, you've got to fit in, you've got to be tolerant, you've got to understand other people's ways of doing things. And I'm going to put this one to you. I spent a lot of time in the Middle East, and I knew that I would upset people if I put my feet on a table and showed them the soles of my feet. I knew I would upset people if I ate with my left hand. It's about understanding that other societies don't necessarily like the way that you do things when you come into their society, isn't it?
I think so. And I think the issue here for me is more a case of, you mentioned at the beginning that an open society should be X, Y, Z. Is France an open society? Is France trying to be an open society? Because if it claims openness, if it claims that, then this doesn't fit. Because from where I'm standing, the hijab is being problematized in a way that many other things are not being problematized. And this particular issue has become a symbol of so much more. Somebody said that all children, Anne said that all children should have the same experience growing up as French children. But I would argue, does that mean that vegan parents are not allowed to give their children, vegan diets? Are Jews no longer allowed to give their children kosher food? Can Rastafarians no longer lock their children's hair because they all have to be imprinted with a French identity? I don't see this as being an issue across French society. This is a Muslim-specific issue, and the hijab is being used as a symbol for a very specific group of people. And I want to know why, because that's what's really happening here.
I'm going to come back and ask you about your face covering, your niqab, in just a moment. But Anne-Elisabeth, I want to put it to you that the suggestion is that French society is being less tolerant, or is it just the establishment that's being intolerant here? French people perhaps aren't.
I was listening to both the participants, Salima and Naima, and I disagree with Naima, but I largely agree with Salima, because it is perfectly true that the French want to put you in a box. It is perfectly true that the French want you to be in a sort of very narrow thing. If you don't have the right studies and you don't have the right curriculum and you don't come from the same place, and it doesn't matter what color or religion you are, if you do not conform to that very French sort of conformist view of how to succeed in society, so to speak, you are different. And I write for an English newspaper and I'm French, and the reason is that it's much more fun to be a journalist in Britain than it is in France. It is much more tolerant. I totally agree with you. I don't think it is specifically aimed at Muslims. I think this prison bill, we can go into this, and there are people within, not the entire conservative group at the French Senate, but there are elements in it that definitely they are targeting Muslims. We shouldn't sort of blind ourselves to that. But I also think that the French system is a system in which, from any kind of attitude to theory to engineering to, it's all about a certain French way, and sometimes it's very difficult to live through it. And you're an entrepreneur, and being an entrepreneur, I would say, yeah, you're right to go to England. France is not the country to do it. As George W. Bush once famously said, France doesn't have a name for entrepreneur, and everybody laughed, but it was so true in so many ways. Entrepreneur has become something important in English, but not in French. And it's also got to that, to be that. And I think it's more general. When you had my grandparents on my mother's side were Russian, and they came to France and they gave to their children French names because it was important to fit in. And that point is, it's the French thing. On the other hand, once you fit in, time. We had the president of the French Senate in 1947 who was a black man. We had Léonard Sédar Senghor, who was a member of the Académie Française. You are then accepted. But I will agree that it's a very narrow way.
You have to be at the higher echelons of society, perhaps, to have the kind of influence that gives your skin color and your background influence. Amina, let me ask you this. I want you to reflect on your time in France. You grew up in France, and you wrote to us saying that you had to lie about why you were wearing a hijab. Tell us that story.
Exactly. So I decided to wear the hijab when I was 16. And in France, under 16, as Elisabeth said, you can't wear the hijab at school. So I remember I had like a small headscarf like this, but still showing my hair on the back. And one day, the director of the school decided to see me in his office and asking me straight away, is it for fashion or is it for religion? And I remember I had to tell him it was for fashion, because I knew if I tell him for religion, I'll be in big trouble in school and maybe fired from school. So yeah, this is that. And I was maybe, I remember 16 or 17 at that time.
Have you ever had trouble in the UK? And I want to reflect on something that Anne-Elisabeth brought up there. Have you ever had trouble in the UK from people suggesting you shouldn't be wearing a headscarf?
Never, never, never. I really see. I remember when I came to UK, I felt like I'm free, finally. And usually I always say, it's like I forget that I have a hijab on my head. And in France, it's different. You feel this pressure. You feel people watching you, like, oh, you have the hijab. Sometimes even asking me, do you speak French? I'm like, yes, I speak French. I have a master's degree. I'm not stupid. But it's like you forget you have a hijab. When you tell about your story in France, I was ashamed to say I'm Algerian. Here, I'm proud of that. I say I'm originally from Algeria and I'm French. And people, they found that.
Can I ask Naima the same thing? You're wearing something, the niqab, that some people might find to be more extreme in their opinion. In the UK, have you ever had difficulties with that?
I would say by and large, the UK has, been very kind to me. I've been able to have a career as an author and, do school visits and, go on TV and radio, and nobody's kind of batted an eyelid. I think because, as has been mentioned, the UK approach to individual choices when it comes to dress are very different to France. And I think that for a very long time, Britain didn't see multiculturalism as a threat to British identity, rather that was embraced. I think that's changing now. The conversation is shifting, but certainly as I was coming up through the 90s and early 2000s, it was come as you are.
So is it just France among European countries that has this attitude, or do you see it across the continent?
Oh, certainly. When it comes to reclaiming a sense of national identity that explicitly excludes Muslims and signs of Muslimness, I would say that this is going across Europe. Definitely a closing of ranks amongst Europeans in defense of their identity, in defense of their history and their, who they are and their own values. Many people have come up and started speaking very openly, saying that, if you want to be in our countries, be like us, because this is our country and we have the right to say how we'd like things done in our country. So it's definitely a conversation that is happening more and more across Europe.
Let's pause for a moment and just listen to what some young French women who would like to wear the hijab, sometimes do wear the hijab, had to say to TRT World when we interviewed them.
It's exhausting to constantly discuss us and our access to employment or swimming pools. Enough. So we must act. This French women-led movement, Pas touche à mon hijab, raises awareness and call to the solidarity to put an end to this sexism and anti-Muslim hatred before it's too late. This is the cause of all, the cause of our freedom and human rights.
As a young Muslim woman who loves sports, I won't be allowed anymore to engage freely in sports. While we were already fighting against discrimination at the gyms in universities, now the Senate wants to make it a legal impossibility for me to compete in sports. That's my rights and freedoms that are taken away from me.
This bill against separatism is really a bill that separates me from my rights and freedoms, separates women from society. It is sexist, oppressive, and Islamophobic.
Hands off my freedoms.
Hands off my rights.
Hands off my hijab.
So, Anne-Elisabeth, they say hands off my hijab. What do you think the reaction is going to be if this gets through the National Assembly, if this becomes law?
I think it's very unlikely that the harder measures within that bill, which was comprehensively rewritten by the hard faction of the Conservative Party in the Senate, will pass the National Assembly, because you must remember that that bill was initiated by Emmanuel Macron's party and it was much softer. I think some aspects, such as young girls should not be veiled, that will go on. I think that the whole thing about mothers not being allowed to wear the hijab if they take children to school visits, I think that will be probably toned down, and that it's a combination of, again, saying you must provide what we call secularism, laïcité. The whole point is to provide a neutral space, and they're similarly not supposed to wear crosses or any sign of any other religion. But it's not going to go to university, even though the senators, the right-wing senators, wanted to make it impossible to wear a hijab in university. And the whole point of the 2004 bill is precisely that when you're 18, you make your own choices. If you want to wear a hijab, you can wear it in university. That is probably not going to change. So it's first of all, there's going to be discussion in committee between the National Assembly and the Senate to discuss what can be taken of all those amendments before they sort of bring into the National Assembly. We're talking, this is a law that's not passing before the end of May, I would say at the soonest, and it's not set in concrete yet.
Okay, Naima, do you think people will react against it, or will they just find ways of getting around it if it comes in?
I think that everybody will make their own decisions based on sort of where they are. There may be some people, in fact, at university, I remember doing a research paper on the exodus of Muslims from France to the UK for exactly this reason, and it was in the 90s. So there will be some who will start looking at their options to say, if the hijab isn't welcome, how much of our lives are actually going to be livable here, and maybe start looking elsewhere. There'll be others who get creative, and others who, will say, because it's about making a choice, isn't it? If your life is curtailed, if your opportunities are curtailed because of this, then you're now looking at, okay, this aspect of my religion versus the life I want to live, which one will I choose? And
okay, so that leads me to wonder about the politics of this. Amina, let me ask you this. Does what we've just heard from Naima, her suggestion that more people will leave, fall into the idea that Emmanuel Macron would like to see that happen as he takes on Marine Le Pen, most likely, in the second round of the presidential election? She being so against immigration, he equally wants to show that he doesn't want immigrants to seemingly be able to get away with things.
I completely agree with Naima, and it's already the case. People are leaving. Like me, I left UK. All my friends here, they are the same: Algerian, Moroccan, Tunisian from France. People are leaving to Canada, where there is a really good rules for immigrants. For Middle East as well. I remember when I was looking for a job in France, and I used to see my mentor, like it's universal credits in UK. And he used to tell me, have you thought about Middle East? I was like, but I'm French. Why should I think about Middle East? I'm here. My family is here. I'm French. No, but with your hijab, you should think about it. And it's what people do. Or if they stay in France, they become entrepreneur because they know they can't find a job. And it's Emmanuel Macron who was saying, like, if you have a name like Mohammed or Naima, it's better for you to find a client. So it's better for you to be an entrepreneur than to find a boss.
And is that really, Anne-Elisabeth, what Macron wants? Is that the type of person he is? Or is he simply playing a very cynical game of politics? That is not at heart the sort of man he is.
I think, first of all, I never heard Macron saying, if your name is Mohammed, you should be an entrepreneur. That is more something like Éric Zemmour, who's an extreme right, far right polemicist, says. Macron doesn't say that. And he has actually welcomed the notion of immigration in France more than other presidents before him. Is he playing the electorate at the time of a presidential election, which he might lose? That is probably possible too. But I mean, he's just given an interview about matters not entirely far away from this, especially in the matter of Algeria, about colonialism to CBS in America, in which he said that these are questions that we have to tackle. So I think he's got a few basic convictions that are acceptable for everyone, but then I think he models his speech depending on who he speaks to, which may or may not be something that will, earn him a victory in May 22. I don't know. It is cynical.
What happens to France, Amina, if, as has been suggested on this program, more and more Muslims are leaving the country, more and more Muslims feel that they have no kind of welcome in the country? What will France become?
I think people, they don't see Muslim people like as smart people. They think we live in France just to get the helps and the helps of the government. But we are smart. Like, for example, I'm building my business and France lost me. Other people is the same. They are building their business outside France. And this is all about economy, bringing new ideas in France, open-minded, but this is the difference between France and UK.
Okay, Naima, let me put this one to you. Where do you think Europe as a whole is going with this idea that it says we have to maintain secular societies? Many Muslims feel that excludes them from this, and yet many European societies are built on secular values. It's two heads meeting and banging and clashing, and no good can come of that, surely.
It's a very difficult, I call it an existential crisis, not between Muslims and Europeans, but within European or Western society. There is a fight for the heart of Western civilization. That's what I'm seeing. And, we know that the history between sort of Islam and the West, Europe, etc., it dates back. We've got Orientalism, we've got, the war on terror. I mean, it's a very fraught relationship. This is not a relationship that has had too many examples of people being able to work together and live in harmony. We've got a few, but not many. So as Europe and the Western world in general decides who they want to be, all the conversations we've been having about colonialism, about revising history, about curriculum, etc., all of these culture wars are really endemic in every society that you look at.
Let me put this suggestion to you, that young people, because we're talking about the hijab in France possibly being banned for those under the age of 18, young people are being dragged into this conflict against their will. And what France is actually trying to do is to say you cannot make young people, you cannot force them to do something like this, to wear the hijab, when in fact they are still growing up and making their own decisions. We're making that decision for you. You cannot make it for them at the moment because you're not qualified to do so. That's a fair point, isn't it?
Well, I mean, what right does the state have to tell parents what they can do with their children? I mean, and how far does that stretch? If you say that parents can't force their children to do this, but you are forcing them to do something else as a state. So again, it's an existential question. How far does the state reach into private lives, into private homes, into families, into parents and communities? Unfortunately, the state kind of gets to decide unless society feels, no, you know what, this is a step too far. This is something we should be able to decide for our own children. But at the end of the day, I think the state will have the last word. So.
Okay, well, let's be absolutely clear on this. The state is not interfering in your own home. It's only interfering, as you put it, if you happen to be wearing a hijab, you're under 18 in a public place. But Anne-Elisabeth, let me come back to you for a means of answering what we've just heard from Naima. This is the state telling people how to live, and that's not right.
That is not the state telling people what to do. That is the law of the country, which is really different from this sort of Orwellian system that Naima tries to describe. It is not true. The law of the country has always existed. The secularism has been enshrined in French tradition in law in 1905, and quite honestly, everybody knows about this, and that's the whole point about the law being the same for all. They're saying you can't do this in a specific case because we want children to grow up having their family where they do what they please and being exposed to their own cultural tradition, and within the public space. And when you're growing up, you should also know what the alternatives are, and then you can make your decision. That's it.
I have a limited amount of time, and I'm going to go to Amina at the very end. You left France. You felt under pressure at school. You felt under pressure at university. You're now working in the UK. Will you ever go back, do you think, to live in France?
No, never. To be honest, never. And if one day I leave UK, it's gonna be another country than France. But France for me is only for my family. But no more.
Thank you all very much indeed. Merci beaucoup to each and every one of you. Thank you for coming on this program, wherever you happen to be watching this edition of Roundtable. I'd like to thank you. We'd like to welcome you back on another occasion. But for now, from me, David Foster, goodbye.